The palace has weathered centuries of betrayal, but never has its silence been shattered by the voice of a child. When Princess Charlotte, innocent yet unyielding, rose against Queen Camilla after a brutal insult, courtiers gasped. This wasn't a whisper behind velvet curtains. It was a demand loud enough to echo through generations. What could have been said to ignite such fury? The truth is darker than anyone dares to admit. Charlotte was not meant to be the voice of confrontation. At just 9 years old, she was expected to carry herself with grace, to smile politely, to play her role in a kingdom built on quiet obedience. But what unfolded that day proved that silence is not inherited. It is chosen, and Charlotte chose to break it. Her small frame stood defiant, her words unshaken. Courtiers who had seen prime ministers tremble and monarchs fall to scandal now stood frozen, stunned by the boldness of a child. The insult that sparked this defiance remains, for now, cloaked in secrecy. But the reaction it provoked was undeniable. Camilla, who had for years fought to cement her place on the throne, suddenly found herself facing the kind of defiance she had feared most, not from the people, not from Parliament, but from within the family itself. It was a scene that left the air thick with tension. Charlotte's demand struck like a lightning bolt across the marble silence. Camilla must be thrown out. For centuries, children in the royal family have been used as symbols. Faces on stamps, smiles for cameras, pawns in a long game of dynasty and duty. Rarely have they been voices of rebellion. Yet here was Charlotte, shattering precedent, her courage echoing far beyond the gilded walls. The court had no script for this moment. No protocol prepared them for the raw power of a child speaking the words others dared not. It was the unmasking of an uncomfortable truth. Even the youngest can topple giants if they speak at the right moment. To many watching, it was impossible not to see the shadow of Diana in that instant. Diana, too, had been the one who dared to speak out, to show the cracks in the monarchy's perfect facade. Charlotte, with her unflinching demand, seemed to embody that same spirit, as if her grandmother's courage had been reborn in her. The defiance of one became the symbol of many, the symbol of wounds unhealed, of truths buried but never forgotten. Camilla's history with William's children had always been tense, though carefully hidden behind rehearsed smiles and curated photographs. William never truly forgave, and Catherine's quiet distance spoke volumes. The children, though shielded, were not blind. They grew up in a palace of whispers, where loyalty was traded and scars were carried like heirlooms. When Camilla's insult struck Charlotte, it was more than a careless remark. It was the weight of decades of resentment crashing down, igniting the courage of a child to say what adults never could. The shock of the courtiers lingered long after Charlotte's words faded. For them, the moment was more than an outburst. It was a crack in the palace walls, a revelation that even the monarchy's future heirs were willing to challenge its present rulers. And once a crack appears, it only widens. What began as a child's indignation had now grown into a thunderclap of defiance that no one could ignore. But to understand why Charlotte's words carried such devastating weight, we must uncover the secret history of Camilla's fragile place in the monarchy. Camilla's crown was forged in whispers and shadows, a symbol never fully embraced by the nation or the family. For years, she fought to be seen as queen, but every smile masked the silent war beneath. And when the public grudgingly accepted her, the younger royals did not. What happens when a crown rests on the head of someone never truly wanted? From the very beginning, her legitimacy was fragile, a crown that glittered but never truly gleamed. To the people, she was the intruder who stepped into a role that had once belonged to Diana, the irreplaceable figure who still haunted the collective memory of a nation. While Charles placed the crown upon Camilla's head, the public's applause was muted, their hearts divided. Acceptance came not with joy but with resignation. They endured her presence rather than celebrated it. And in the halls of the monarchy, that cold acceptance felt like a constant reminder of what she could never be. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was even harsher. The children of William and Catherine, heirs to a future monarchy, never truly warmed to her. They were raised in the shadow of their grandmother Diana's legacy, hearing the unspoken but deeply felt truths about pain, betrayal, and the heavy cost of the crown. Though they were taught politeness and discipline, their distance from Camilla was undeniable. Small gestures, the refusal of a smile, the stiffness of posture, the cold silence at family dinners spoke volumes. For Charlotte, it was more than instinct. It was resistance. This tension revealed a generational divide impossible to bridge. The old guard, clinging to tradition, insisted that Camilla had earned her place beside the king. But the younger generation, destined to inherit the crown, saw her as an intruder, a reminder of wounds that had never healed. While Charles defended his queen, William stood quietly apart, his loyalty reserved for Catherine and his children. Every look exchanged across royal gatherings was a silent war, a clash of eras that would one day erupt. The resentment did not begin with Charlotte's outburst. Seeds had been sown long before the insult that would one day ignite the storm. Camilla's uneasy role had always cast shadows over her interactions with the family. Her presence was tolerated, not embraced, her authority questioned at every turn. Behind the polished smiles lay a battlefield of unspoken grudges. For every ribbon cut and hand shaken, there lingered the unvoiced question: what right did she truly have to reign where Diana had once stood? It was in this soil of discontent that Charlotte's defiance took root. She was not merely speaking as a child angered by an insult, she was voicing the suppressed feelings of an entire generation who saw Camilla as a figure of disruption rather than unity. In Charlotte's words lay the echoes of Diana's truth, a legacy of courage that refused to be silenced. And in that defiance, the monarchy's carefully constructed facade trembled. But the insult that broke the silence wasn't born in public. It was whispered in the shadows of a private gathering. Every monarchy has its scars, but some words cut so deep they bleed across generations. The moment Queen Camilla's tongue lashed against Charlotte, she didn't just wound a child, she reopened the wounds of Diana, William, and the nation itself. The insult was cruel, sharp, and deliberate, and Charlotte's fiery response was one the monarchy could never contain. It happened in what was meant to be an ordinary private gathering, a moment behind closed doors where formality briefly softens. But the words that passed from Camilla's lips were anything but casual. With a cold smile, she mocked Charlotte's place in the royal family, suggesting that her future was irrelevant, that she would forever live in the shadow of her brothers and never matter in the grand story of succession. It was a calculated blow, designed to diminish and to silence. But what Camilla had not anticipated was that Charlotte would not only hear the insult, she would rise against it. For Charlotte, the sting of those words carried an unbearable weight. They were not just cruel. They echoed the very pain that had defined her late grandmother Diana's life. Diana had been humiliated, dismissed, and silenced, her voice often smothered by the institution she had married into. And now, decades later, Camilla's barb carried the same venom, this time aimed at the young girl who bore Diana's fierce spirit. It was as though the cruelty of one generation had been passed to another, threatening to crush the future before it could even begin. The response was instantaneous. Shock melted into defiance, and Charlotte, her voice trembling but powerful, declared that she would not be silenced, that no queen had the right to tell her she did not matter. Her words struck like lightning, cutting through centuries of protocol. Witnesses were left in stunned silence, unable to believe what they had just heard. The audacity of a child standing against a queen was almost unthinkable, yet it had happened and there was no undoing it. At that moment, history seemed to repeat itself. The humiliation Diana once endured had resurfaced in her granddaughter, but this time there would be no quiet suffering. Charlotte's fiery defiance made it clear. She was not Diana broken by betrayal. She was Diana reborn, a spirit unwilling to bow. The insult, meant to weaken, instead ignited a fire that threatened to consume the palace from within. With the weight of centuries pressing down, Charlotte delivered her demand, her voice echoing louder than the crown itself. Camilla must be thrown out. It was not a plea, not a protest, but a command that shattered the silence of the room. Gasps filled the air as if the walls themselves had trembled. Never before had a child dared to speak such truth to power, and never before had a queen been so openly challenged. But what made Charlotte's outburst so dangerous was not her words. It was the truth they unveiled about power, succession, and betrayal. Every move Charlotte makes is haunted by a ghost she never met. Diana's spirit lingers, her story whispered into every corner of the palace. And when Charlotte spoke out, it wasn't only her voice that rang, it was Diana's unfinished fight for dignity, roaring back from the grave. Could it be that the people see in Charlotte the same light they once saw in Diana? The echoes were undeniable. The moment Charlotte demanded Camilla's removal, comparisons to Diana erupted across the nation. To many, it felt like a continuation of a battle Diana had fought decades before. A battle she had lost, but one her granddaughter was now determined to reclaim. The same courage that once made Diana beloved by millions seemed to surge through Charlotte's veins, igniting a flame too powerful to extinguish. What made the world weep for Diana was now making them rise for Charlotte. For William, however, This resemblance carried a weight few could imagine. He had watched his mother's suffering in silence as a child, powerless against the tide of cruelty and betrayal that consumed her. Now, he was forced to watch his daughter step into the same storm. The pride he felt in her strength was inseparable from the terror that history was repeating itself, this time through his own child. His heart, torn between admiration and fear, revealed the unbearable truth. Diana's shadow had never left them. It had only shifted from one generation to the next. Catherine, too, felt the chilling touch of this legacy. Every mother's instinct is to protect her child. And yet, she could not shield Charlotte from the crown's ruthless machinery. She feared her daughter's voice, though powerful, might lead her down the same painful road Diana once walked. Catherine's quiet strength was laced with dread, knowing that the bravery which made Charlotte extraordinary also made her vulnerable to the same tragedies that destroyed Diana. The burden was no longer abstract. It lived in her daughter's defiance, demanding a price no mother wants her child to pay. For Camilla, this awakening of Diana's ghost was her greatest nightmare. For years, she had fought to bury the past, to step out from the shadow of the woman whose name would never die. But with every comparison drawn between Diana and Charlotte, the villain of yesterday was once again cast in the spotlight. It was as if no matter how high she climbed, Diana's presence dragged her back down, a constant reminder that she could never rewrite the story in her favor. Charlotte's defiance did not just challenge her authority, it reopened the wound that had defined her entire existence. The press wasted no time in seizing this moment. Headlines painted Charlotte as Diana reborn, the little girl carrying the torch of her grandmother's courage. Images and stories swirled, framing the confrontation not as a family dispute, but as the next chapter in a generational war. To the world, Charlotte's defiance wasn't a child's rebellion. It was destiny fulfilled, a haunting reminder that Diana's spirit had never truly left, only found a new vessel through which to speak. But Diana's ghost was not the only shadow. The corridors of power held another one that Camilla desperately tried to hide. Behind every queen's smile lies a battlefield no one sees. Camilla may have worn the crown, but inside the palace she fought wars of survival, resented by William, distrusted by Catherine, and now defied by Charlotte. The insult was her weapon of desperation, but desperation reveals weakness, and weakness in the palace can be fatal. For all her outward composure, Camilla's reign had been plagued by insecurities. She knew her place was not carved in stone, but in sand, forever shifting with the tides of public opinion and the judgment of those closest to the throne. Though crowned beside Charles, she never truly wore the approval of the nation. That crown, heavy as it was, sat uneasily, always reminding her that she would never be Diana, never be the woman people wanted to see at Charles's side. Each passing day reinforced the same cruel truth. She was tolerated, not celebrated. Within the palace walls, her isolation only deepened. William's cold politeness was a wall she could never scale. Catherine's cautious distance spoke louder than words, a silent reminder that the future of the monarchy rested not with her, but with the next generation. And now, the children once thought too young to matter had become her fiercest critics. Charlotte's defiance had pulled back the veil, exposing Camilla's fragile hold on power. Even George and Louis, though quieter, mirrored the same distance, reinforcing the unspoken divide between Charles's bloodline and hers. The fracture extended beyond her stepchildren. Camilla's own children lived under the shadow of an uncomfortable truth. They would never inherit the privileges that Charles's heirs possessed. This tension poisoned the air, creating a subtle but undeniable rivalry within the family. Camilla long feared that once Charles was gone, her children would be erased from the palace entirely, cut out of the legacy she had fought so bitterly to secure. This dread festered inside her, twisting into the fear that history would remember her as nothing more than a footnote, a queen whose reign was short-lived and unwanted. It was this fear, raw and unrelenting, that drove her to lash out at Charlotte. The insult was not crafted from cruelty alone, but from panic. In Charlotte's courage, Camilla saw the threat of being overshadowed once more, just as Diana's memory had overshadowed her for decades. The child's defiance was not merely disobedience, it was the embodiment of everything Camilla had battled against. Irrelevance, rejection, and the ghost of a woman she could never outrun. Her words were sharp, but they revealed her deepest weakness. And in the palace, a weakness revealed is a weakness exploited. For those who witnessed it, the insult was more than a moment of cruelty. It was a breaking point. The queen had shown her desperation, And desperation inside the monarchy is dangerous. Already whispers began circulating among courtiers that Camilla's reign was faltering. For the first time, serious discussions hinted at the possibility that her position might not survive the storm now building around her. And when whispers of Charlotte's defiance reached the outside world, the public's reaction was unlike anything the monarchy had prepared for. When the story escaped the palace walls, the nation gasped, and then it roared. Suddenly, this wasn't just a family squabble. The public, scarred by Diana's pain and emboldened by Charlotte's courage, demanded justice. Social media ignited, headlines blared, and for the first time, Camilla faced an enemy she couldn't silence: the will of the people. The confrontation that had been meant to remain hidden within the palace's golden corridors spread like wildfire. A single whisper became a headline, and within hours, the world knew of the insult that had crossed the line. What should have been contained as an internal conflict became a matter of public outrage, amplified by millions who remembered Diana's tears and saw in Charlotte a continuation of that same story. The palace could no longer claim silence. It had been pierced, and the noise outside grew deafening. The nation's response was swift and unforgiving. Outrage swept across the press, with front pages decrying the cruelty of a queen toward a child. Commentators spoke of history repeating itself, of wounds never healed, of a monarchy too blind to learn from its mistakes. Social media became a battlefield, and on that battlefield, Charlotte was crowned not with jewels, but with reverence. She was hailed as the new Diana, fearless, honest, unwilling to bow to power. For many, this comparison was not just symbolic, but prophetic, a sign that the spirit of Diana lived on in her granddaughter's defiance. As voices grew louder, the demands became clear. Camilla must step down. What began as whispers of discontent escalated into organized fury. Petitions gained thousands of signatures within days. Editorials called for her removal. And the phrase, "throw her out," trended globally. The queen who had fought so hard to wear the crown now found herself clinging to it with trembling hands. Her legitimacy shattered in the eyes of those she had once hoped to win over. William and Catherine, once cautious in public, were suddenly swept into the storm. Every camera lens sought their reaction. Every word they spoke dissected for hidden meaning. Their silence was interpreted as support for their daughter, and their restrained expressions were read as quiet defiance against Camilla's reign. In the public's eyes, William and Catherine had become symbols of dignity under fire, their loyalty to Charlotte a stark contrast to the crown's fragile defenses. Yet behind the polished exterior, they were trapped, struggling to balance their duty with the raw pain of their child's humiliation. And then there was Charles, torn apart by a conflict that cut deeper than any political scandal. As king, his duty was to uphold stability, to protect the crown at any cost. As a husband, he was bound to defend Camilla. Yet, as a father and grandfather, his heart was pulled mercilessly toward William and Charlotte. His silence became unbearable. His indecision read as weakness. His loyalty questioned by all sides. To stand by Camilla risked alienating his legacy. To side with Charlotte risked destroying his marriage. The king was cornered, and the world was watching. But while the people rallied, the palace itself was descending into war, and the battle lines were clearer than ever. Behind the palace gates, loyalty is currency, and betrayal is survival. As the scandal grew, whispers turned into strategies, and alliances hardened. Some courtiers sided with Camilla, others with William and Catherine. But it was Princess Anne who delivered the quiet warning. This will end in exile. The palace, once a place of carefully guarded unity, had become a house divided. Conversations that were once polite exchanges turned into veiled accusations. Every room carried an undercurrent of suspicion. Factions began to emerge, each calculating where the balance of power would tilt. Those loyal to Camilla argued that to weaken her was to weaken the king. But others, quietly emboldened by Charlotte's defiance, insisted that Camilla had overstepped, that her presence had become a liability too great to ignore. It was no longer a question of who was right. It was a question of survival. At the center of this storm stood Anne, her voice steady and unshaken by the chaos. She had seen scandals rise and fall, and had witnessed how loyalty, when misplaced, could sink the crown itself. As the walls of tradition trembled, she warned those around her that the monarchy could not endure if it clung to a queen despised both within and beyond the palace gates. Her words were not emotional, but sharp, a sober reminder that history has no mercy for those who refuse to adapt. William, however, did not speak with caution. His defense of Charlotte was fierce, uncompromising, and at times explosive. For him, the battle was not political, but deeply personal. He had carried the memory of Diana's humiliation for decades, and he would not allow his daughter to bear the same scars. His resolve became a rallying point for many within the household, who saw in him not only a protective father, but a future king unwilling to bend under the weight of silence. His passion was contagious, but it also deepened the divide, making reconciliation nearly impossible. Catherine, behind closed doors, carried the storm in her own way. She had always been a symbol of composure. But the thought of her daughter stepping into the same fire that had consumed Diana left her shaken. Those closest to her described moments of private breakdowns, where the burden of motherhood and monarchy collided. She feared that Charlotte's courage, though extraordinary, would place her in the crosshairs of a ruthless institution. The strength she showed in public masked a heart breaking in private, torn between pride and dread. And yet, for all the conflict, it was Charles who seemed most powerless. As king, his duty was to hold the family together, to command respect and restore order. But each attempt to calm the storm only revealed his helplessness. Torn between his love for Camilla and the rising tide of loyalty to his son and granddaughter, he found himself paralyzed. His words, once meant to unify, fell flat, carrying no weight in a palace where respect was quickly eroding. Whispers grew louder, turning into quiet conversations among courtiers. Perhaps the solution lay not in defending Camilla, but in removing her. Ideas began to form softly at first, then more boldly that her official duties could be reduced, her role diminished, her presence carefully erased without public acknowledgement. It was a dangerous thought, but one that spread like wildfire. If loyalty to the crown meant sacrificing the queen, some were ready to make that choice. And then came the night when Charlotte, standing beside her mother, delivered a demand no one dared to imagine. It was a moment for the history books not of crowns and ceremonies, but of truth and fury. Charlotte stood tall before her family, her voice trembling yet unbreakable. She demanded that Camilla be cast out of the palace. No compromise, no apology, only exile. And as silence gripped the royal hall, one question thundered: would Charles obey his granddaughter or his queen? Charlotte's words did not falter. What had begun as a child's defiance now crystallized into a demand, clear and undeniable. Her voice echoed against centuries of tradition, breaking the illusion that silence could hold this fractured family together. For those present, it was not the voice of a child they heard. It was the voice of history, the echo of every suppressed truth roaring through her. The monarchy, so accustomed to controlling its narrative, was suddenly being rewritten by a girl unafraid to defy its weight. William stood beside his daughter like a shield. His posture, firm and resolute, was the clearest declaration of loyalty he had ever made. He did not speak immediately because he didn't need to. His presence was his answer. By standing with Charlotte, he stood against Camilla. He chose to protect his child's dignity over preserving the palace's fragile peace. It was the very moment his mother, Diana, would have longed to see a son unwilling to let another generation suffer the same humiliation she endured. His silence was not a weakness. It was power, sharpened by the force of his daughter's courage. Catherine, too, was there. Though her strength was veiled in tears, she did not speak, but her presence was no less powerful. Her eyes glistened as she watched Charlotte claim a voice she herself had never dared to raise against Camilla. Catherine's silent weeping was not sorrow alone, it was pride and fear entwined. Pride that her daughter had the courage to do what others could not. Fear of what that courage might cost her. But even in her silence, her body leaned forward, closer to Charlotte, closer to William. Her stance was a quiet vow. Her daughter would never stand alone. Camilla's reaction was the collapse of everything she had fought to build. For years, she had hidden behind poise, behind a carefully curated mask of composure. But in that moment, the mask shattered. Her eyes betrayed shock, then disbelief, and finally, desperation. To be challenged by William was painful. To be despised by Catherine was expected. But to be condemned by Charlotte, the granddaughter of Diana, the living face of the monarchy's future, this was destruction. No words could repair what had been broken. The crown on her head weighed heavier than ever before, no longer a symbol of triumph, but of isolation. And then there was Charles. The king stood silent, as though trapped between two worlds, each demanding his loyalty. His wife, Camilla, who had stood by him through decades of scandal and rejection, waited for his defense. His granddaughter, Charlotte, innocent yet unyielding, demanded her removal. His son, William, stared at him with unspoken expectations. His daughter-in-law, Catherine, silently wept for his decision. For Charles, the silence was agony. To choose his wife was to fracture the family. To choose his granddaughter was to betray the woman he had sacrificed everything to love. His stillness revealed what words could not. The monarchy itself was at breaking point. Caught between the past it could not escape, and the future it could no longer control. The hall was frozen, the silence louder than any outburst, every second stretching into eternity. For the first time, the survival of the monarchy seemed less certain than ever before, not because of politics, not because of scandal, but because of truth spoken by the youngest voice in the room. But the story did not end in that room. It spilled into the future, leaving a legacy no one could undo. History will remember crowns and coronations, but sometimes it is the cry of a child that reshapes destiny. Charlotte's defiance didn't just expose Camilla, it exposed the fragility of the monarchy itself. And as the world waits for the final verdict, one truth remains undeniable. The future belongs not to those who wear the crown, but to those brave enough to challenge it. Her words became more than an outburst. They became a turning point. Charlotte's courage revealed a crack in the monarchy's foundation that could never be sealed again. Camilla's position, once defended with ceremony and tradition, now lay permanently scarred, a crown tainted by the demand of a child who dared to speak the truth. William and Catherine, in that moment, realized their children were no longer symbols of continuity, but forces of change, heirs whose voices carried the power to alter the very direction of the crown. The monarchy, tied so tightly to bloodlines and duty, now found its legacy tethered to its youngest heirs, children whose innocence had been shattered by conflict, but whose strength might carry the institution into a new era. Charlotte may never wear the crown, but her defiance marked her as a queen in spirit, a figure destined to be remembered for breaking silence when it mattered most. And so, the question that began in whispers now echoes across the world. When even a child demands change, how long can the monarchy resist? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.